Alright guys, so today I've been invited here to PLO Lumumba house to have an interview or conversation with him. Stay tuned, man. I only have 20 minutes to talk to him, but hopefully I will manage to ask important questions that you guys would love to hear and that you guys as well suggested you wanted this to happen. It is happening. So stay tuned and enjoy the interview. This is the journey to One Africa. Professor,
yes,
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you
for inviting me to your place, and thank you for everything that you're doing. This is my first time to meet you, and for a long time, it has been more than 7 years. I've honestly watched almost all of your speeches on YouTube, so I've been a big fan, and I've been learning from you from afar, from a distance. But I thank God that I have this opportunity to stay close to you right now, and hopefully this will continue as well, because I have a lot of things that I want to learn from you. But apart from that, I'm leading a community, and for a long time they've been wanting to have this conversation. So I'm here representing our community, Swahili Nation, and there's just a few questions that I would love to get to know from you. The first thing is, everything that you do and all the interviews that I've watched, I've been very curious to know what led to what you are doing. Because I think I've tried so many times to discover that, and I haven't figured out. The first time when you started this movement, this passion, everything about Africa, how did it start? What really triggered that passion?
The desire to do good, and I believe being mentored by men and women who stood for justice, stood for good governance, stood for servant leadership. Some of them mentoring me remotely, some of them mentoring me practically. Individuals such as Julius Kambarage Nyerere, whom I had the privilege of meeting as a student in 1984, and had the privilege of working with people like John Garang de Mabior, whom I had the privilege of meeting when he was alive and worked with as a student. These are individuals who in many ways represented a category of people who simply wanted to do good.
Yes.
And that has been the motivating factor, the recognition that the more we remain disunited, the weaker we are and the more exploitable we are. And that indeed is the driving force.
And why for a long time, for many years, we have seen a lot of things not going in the way that we want them to go, us as Africans, maybe even being disappointed as well. Why you still remain the same, having hope for Africa, having hope for youth, having hope for this continent? Where is that coming from?
The history of humanity, the history of life is a history of trials and tribulations. And history has demonstrated consistently and times without number that those who ultimately win the race are those who remain optimistic. And therefore, when we judge ourselves, we ought not to judge ourselves too harshly. Remember that this is a continent that has borne the brunt of slavery, borne the brunt of colonization, is now bearing the brunt of neo-colonization, borne the brunt of our very own individual politicians and in their collectivity who do not desire to serve the community. And when we realize that that is the situation, we cannot surrender to those unfortunate realities. It is our duty to try and be agents of change. And once again, I must go back to Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere, who said, it can be done. Play your part. And it is incumbent upon us to remember that throughout history, it is young people who have brought about changes, whether you talk about the struggle for political independence in Africa, it was young leaders.
Yes.
Mention all of them, whether it's Nkrumah, Ture, or Modibo, or Amilcar, or Lumumba, or Nyerere. All these were young individuals. And if you go into other civilizations, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Bantu Stephen Biko, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Samora Machel. And if you look at that, these are young people who have always come out. You remember fondly the activities in South Africa, in the Sharpeville massacre, how they came about, the Soweto massacres, how they came about, and even when some within their ranks are killed, that blood waters their enthusiasm. And that is what we must do going forward, in the knowledge that we are mere mortals.
Yes.
And we are but on the stage for a few years, and we help build the thing that we desire, block by block, village by village.
And that brought me to another question, Professor. For a long time, you've been talking about decolonization of the mind. And, you know, when I travel, I came from South Africa, and when I go to countryside, I see the need of education. And not merely the professional education, but the education of knowing who we are. Yesterday, we were having here conversation, and one of the things that came to my mind that I think more than just, you know, locking down ourselves from the rest of the world, maybe perhaps we have to lock down our mind, in the sense that decolonizing our mind first. If we understand who we are and we know that we have a role to play in the world, then I believe we'll be able to go there and shine here in Africa and even international as well. So my question is, how can we bring this education of decolonization of the mind, especially in the rural village? Because there they don't have internet, they don't have this access that we have. Yes.
You know, there is a beautiful Swahili saying, Jishinde, ushinde.
Yes, yes.
Once you conquer yourself and you know who you are, that is when you can actually achieve victory.
Yeah.
I've been listening rather frequently lately to a speech delivered by Marcus Garvey in the 19th century, where he says, know who you are. You must know who you are, because it is by knowing who you are that you actually are capable of defining what you need and what you want.
Absolutely.
And formal education that you and me have had the opportunity of going through must be seen for what it is. It has its value, but it was also an exercise in indoctrination. If you are colonized by the British, they indoctrinated you. The French indoctrinated you, the Belgians indoctrinated you, the Portuguese indoctrinated you, the Arabs indoctrinated you. And that's why when fella Anikula Pokuti of Nigeria says, teacher, don't teach me nonsense, I hear fella. And he is saying that in the midst of all that we call education, we must be able to distill the things that are truly useful to us. And that can only be done when we educate the masses.
Yes.
And the masses are not to be found in urban Africa, they are to be found in rural Africa.
That's true.
And that is why the thing that we now call civic education is very critical. But what kind of education? It is the kind of education that opens their eyes. And when I look at some of the early leaders who are clear in this thing, they had what they call political education. People like Samora, people like Nyerere, people like Amilcar Cabral, people like Modibo Keita. These were people, Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, they said, we must start from the grassroots. We must begin to educate our people and tell them the ideals, what Nyerere used to call the taboos, the things that you just don't do because it is not right to do them, and the things that you must do, which are the ideals. And I urge younger people to read Azimio la Arusha in Tanzania in 1967-1968, which formed the bedrock upon which Nyerere at that time and TANU and later Chama cha Mapinduzi wanted to interact with people. If you look at that document, Azimio la Arusha, and is one of the critical documents in political education, then you are able to recognize that it is important to go to rural Africa and talk to the people and create an environment where they can learn about themselves, learn about their society, learn about their role in society, and therefore become good members of the society. And when they do that, they do it very effectively. Educating the people must be from the grassroots.
Yes.
And we must understand this in the context of what other civilizations have done. And that is how, when I talk about Azimio la Arusha and what Mwalimu Nyerere tried to do, it had its own weaknesses.
Yes.
But you cannot fault the reasoning behind it. The reasoning being that if you educate the masses and they are better able to understand who they are, and they are able to understand what the society expects of them, then they become good members of the society, then their contribution to the society becomes effective. If you look at quite a number of countries in those early days, you organize people and communities around 10 homesteads. And when you do that, if you want to deal with them on issues of health, of issues of agriculture, on issues of communal organization, then you are better able to penetrate a critical mass. And it is the creation of a critical mass of the people that will then create an environment where their minds can be decolonized. And once their minds are decolonized, then they can become agents of positive change. And that is what we are urging the communities that we now have of young people. We now have technology, which in itself is an instrument and a medium of indoctrination. You are bombarded with so much information that sometimes it is difficult to filter out the information that you need and the information that is useful. So we must be very clear how we consume the information that we interact with. If you go to countries in the East, such as China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, you see a deliberate effort on the part of those societies to create a critical mass of young people who are saying, I love China, I love Thailand, I love India, I love South Korea. They love themselves. Africans must be able to do that and say, we love Africa, and they must mean it. They must not just be words coming out of their mouth, they must be conviction coming out of their hearts. And once they do that, then they can be agents of positive change for the continent of Africa.
Professor, one of the things that I've been thinking lately is about our system, and especially African government system. I almost believe that even if we have a good leader coming up to our government, but in a way they always turn and become something else. So I can't stop wondering myself, that is this because of the system that we have, that the system is already broken, so it doesn't matter how good you are, but the system will transform and change you, turn you to something else or someone else? So what is the problem, and how can we change that? If it is the system, then how are we going to change the system?
No, I no longer hold the view that systems change people.
Yes.
Positions of power only reveals who you are. It doesn't change you. If you are a bad person, it now becomes possible for the society to see you in your splendor. It reveals who you are. It exposes who you are. Because within the continent of Africa, there have been good leaders, and there are people who are in positions of leadership who desire to do good. Even in the face of a lot of headwinds and a lot of adversities, but they desire to do good. I'll not name them by name, all of them. But they were convicted. It doesn't mean that they were making mistakes. I mean, people like Nyerere, Kaunda, Samora, Mandela, Lumumba, Modibo, Ben Bella, Amilcar Cabral, and many others were individuals who, throughout their lives, even as they made mistakes, you could see that they were trying to create systems which would be beneficial to the societies. And of course, those who are our colonizers stood in their way. And even without going too deep into history, Individuals such as in the political arena, that's
Yes.
what I'm talking about, because that is the leadership that impacts on all other leadership. People like Thomas Isidore Sankara, within a very short time, were trying to change their societies in a very positive way. People like Paul Kagame, people like John Joseph Pombe Magufuli were trying to do that in a very visible way. People like Kwek Masire in Botswana were trying to do so during our very lifetimes. And there are many others that one can mention. And these individuals are individuals who are animated by the desire to do good. Remember that the systems we inherited from the colonizers are also problematic.
Yes.
These systems were designed to be oppressive. These systems were designed not to serve the African communities. When we regained political independence, we did not disturb them much. And therefore, we are still grappling with them, trying to find out how it is that we can make them work. That great American historian and social commentator John Henry Clark said that when African countries regained independence, all of them without exception inherited systems of government from their erstwhile colonizers, and none of them, he said, will ever succeed on the basis of those systems. So the time is now that we must begin to ask ourselves, how do we learn from other civilizations but create systems that can work in our environment? It is an ongoing conversation. It's a conversation that is alive and well, particularly now that you begin to see resentment from many Africans, which is legitimizing the coup d'etats that we have seen lately in Guinea-Conakry, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Gabon. It is a reaction to a reality. That the people we give the instruments of power are not serving us, they are serving themselves and their hidden masters from outside of the continent. It is not going to be easy. It is not going to be done and achieved in one generation. But we must keep the faith alive in the knowledge that endurance winneth the race.
One thing that young people can learn from His Excellency X Magufuli, so you had an opportunity to meet up with him. If there's one thing that you will tell our youth to learn one thing from him.
You know, conviction. Magufuli was convicted. He was persistent. He was courageous. And conviction and courage to do good are essential ingredients, particularly when you are working in an environment where you have many naysayers who only recognize that you are doing good when they have seen the results. The process is painful, but the result is desirable. As the old saying goes, you can't make an omelette without breaking the egg. And that is what we in Africa must recognize. Sometimes you've got to bleed in order to heal. Well,
what is your opinion on BRICS?
You know, we must go into BRICS with our eyes open. Our eyes open because the leading countries in BRICS are also countries that want to dominate. China wants to dominate. India wants to dominate. And African countries going into such arrangement must be very careful to ensure that once again we do not play the role of being subservient participants. We have been in too many of these organizations where our role is just to add up the numbers. We know how we are disregarded in the organization, or rather in the United Nations organization. We know how we are disregarded in the G20. We know how we are not even considered in the G7. And the time is now to ask ourselves, this arrangement that we are getting into, which is BRICS, it looks good on the outside, but once bitten, twice shy. So I urge African countries to go into such organizations a lot more carefully. If it was me who was determining how we should operate, I would say, let us strengthen the African Union.
Absolutely.
Let us make the African Union a mega organization that is strong politically, that is strong ideologically, that is strong diplomatically, and therefore we relate to the world through the medium of the African Union. That way, we would immunize ourselves against the machinations of other civilizations. Europe is doing that a lot more progressively now. They come to the world as the EU. They don't come to the world in critical things as Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, which may or may not be members of the EU, but I'm giving these as examples. But this is what we must do. The AU must be strong. But if we keep on jumping, as you see our leaders jumping from one country to the other, being summoned by this or that country to be given some pittance, then Africa will always remain weak. And if she remains weak, she will be manipulated. If she remains weak, she will be exploited. If she remains weak, she will be controlled.
Yes, sir. Two final questions. The first one is, what is the role of social media with youth? Because you know, as now everybody's on TikTok and all these social media. What is the role of that to promoting Pan-Africanism and bring this awareness of Africa?
Social media is with us to stay. They are to fight it. Therefore, to fight it will be an exercise in futility. The question is, how do we use it to communicate positive communication? And my view is, it is organization. Those of us who are convicted about Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Africanism to mean doing things that are in the best interest of the peoples of African origin, whether they are in the mother continent or in the diaspora, in all spheres of life, whether it's in agriculture, education, technology. How do we leverage on this medium that allows us to communicate and to engage almost instantaneously? We must feed our media with news that is going to irrigate and fertilize the minds of young men and women across the continent, which means we must also control this media. Right now, we depend on media from the West and from the East. The Chinese who are using this media, if you go there and you have been in that part of the world, they have their own. They have their own Weibo. They have their own media. Africa must now ensure that we have our own satellites up there, that we have our own instruments there, that we have our own social media platforms where we filter the kind of information that we want to go out to our young men and women. Otherwise, we are consumers of technology and media which can be switched off at any one time because we are not in control of them. So the next stage in the Pan-African struggle is to migrate from this media in order to ensure that we create things that are custom-made for the benefit of the continent of Africa and our peoples.
Wonderful, wonderful, Professor. Final question. It is about the foundation that we just launched 2 days ago, PI. What is all about, and how can people get involved? Even myself as well, I would love to be involved.
The PanAfrican Institute, which we launched on the 9th day of November at Kenya University in Kenya, is an institute that has been brought about to create an environment where we can incubate ideas which are Pan-Africanist, and Pan-Africanist understood to mean things that will benefit, as I've already said, the people of Africa, whether they're in the mother continent or in the diaspora, in all spheres of life, whether, as I've said, and I repeat it for effect, in agriculture, in education, in health, in all spheres of technology. And once they have been incubated there, they will then be deployed across the continent for purposes of their being monetized and they are being propagated to improve the quality of people's lives. What we have done in Kenya is simply to launch. This is a launch pad. We expect to have this footprint everywhere in the continent of Africa. in Lusaka, Zambia, in Dodoma in Tanzania, in Kampala in Uganda, in Accra in Ghana, throughout the continent of Africa, so that we can have discourses of our own, so that our intellectuals can begin to have debates which are beneficial to the continent of Africa. You see, all other civilizations have institutes of this kind. The Chinese have their own Confucius Institute and all these institutes. And all these institutes that we see from different parts of the world are institutes that are designed to benefit them. Exactly. And we too, we must not just agonize, we must organize. And what we are telling the world and Africans is that we are now in the organization phase. That is where the Pan-African Institute comes into being. It is not going to be easy. It is going to be a long and sometimes painful battle, but we have begun. And the work begins now. The launch is the easy part of it. The journey begins. And it is going to be a journey that is going to be undertaken and sustained by young intellectual warriors in the continent of Africa and in the African diaspora.
You better be involved, Professor. My final request, I want to be your son. I know I told you this one.
No, as I've said, as many as are Pan-Africanists, as many as are convicted in the journey of making sure that the mother continent is a continent that deserves to be served, there are as many as will be our daughters and sons.
Thank you so much.
So be blessed.
Amen.
And welcome. When we create these things, we are saying, you are the ones who are going to make them work.
Thank you so much.
Make them work. Make them work in the knowledge that what you do will be useful to humanity. Make them work in the knowledge that when we plant the seed, the seed must be watered, the seed must be pruned, and ultimately the tree will grow, and ultimately under the shade of that tree, we will have comfort. We say in Kiswahili, mchumia juani, hulia kivulini, mgaga na upwa, hali wali mkavu.
Thank you so much, Professor. Asante sana. Thank you very much.
Take it off. Oh, we should take it off.
This is highlight.
Oh, it's highlight.
Good. And we brought it to you, highlight honey as well.
This is beautiful.
Yeah.